is called the Operationalization of the Trade Facilitation Agreement. So I hope you're in the right place, and if you're not, stay because it's going to be a really good panel. My name is Anna Guevara. I am a senior advisor for CSIS in the project on prosperity and development. I'm also a strategy consultant based out of Miami on trade and customs issues. With our panel today, also we have next to me Sarah Thorne, Senior Director of International Trade and Supply Chain Global Management Affairs at Walmart. Thank you for coming, Sarah. And next to Sarah, Virginia Brown, Director of the Office of Trade and Regulatory Reforms at USAID. And to my left, last but certainly not least, Vice President of Global Customs Policy and Public Affairs at UPS and Chair of the ICC Commission on Customs and Trade Facilitation. Thank you all for coming and joining us. And I want to thank Chris at the back of the room for helping to put together this panel and all the logistics and help, and to everyone in your office. My opening comments today are going to focus on a paper that was just published yesterday on the CSIS website called "The Clock Has Started on TFA Implementation." It was written by Dan Rundy and Rachel Page, is she here, who are part of the CSIS project on prosperity and development. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, I urge you and highly recommend that you take a look at it after the panel because it raises further questions that we're able to discuss here today, and I think it'll be interesting to take a look at. So what does this article mean, the clock has started on TFA implementation? As you may know, the World Trade Organization's Trade Facilitation Agreement, the TFA, entered into force in February of this year. So what is the TFA? The TFA is a multilateral trade agreement of 164 member countries that seek to modernize, simplify, harmonize customs procedures. The agreement has provisions that sets implementation date goals and a process by which countries can seek funding and support. The TFA will lead to an increase in the free flow of trade, export diversification, value chain inclusiveness, and decrease corruption on a global level. According to the WTO, the costs of implementation will be modest compared to the anticipated benefits. What are the benefits of the FTA? The FTA is estimated to produce up to $1 trillion in global export gains annually, and to create 20 million new jobs worldwide. A 2015 study conducted by the WTO estimates that complete implementation of the TFA will cut members' trade costs by an average of 14.3%. The 2015 OECD Trade Facilitation Indicators support this figure. So how does this help developing countries? After all, we are the Project on Prosperity and Development. And the resulting economic gains of the agreement will spur the creation of new products and market destinations through export diversification. This will better integrate developing countries into global value chains, increasing efficiency and lowering costs across the board. Given the strong intertwinement of trade and investment, those that implement the TFA will attract more foreign direct investment to aid their countries in economic growth. Why is this good for the U.S.? The United States will benefit from a fully implemented TFA. It is expected to shorten the time that it takes to import goods by 1.5 days and to export goods by nearly 2 days. These reduced delays translate to lower costs for U.S. businesses, lower prices for U.S. consumers, greater market accessibility for U.S. firms of all sizes, and sustainable economic growth worldwide. This economic advancement of developing economies will lead to the creation of new markets for the U.S. to broaden its consumer base and increase purchasing power of consumers abroad for U.S. products. So what's next? Now that the TFA has been ratified, what are the next steps? What are the benefits of U.S. leadership in TFA full implementation? We have now moved away from high diplomacy in Geneva to a conversation about foreign aid and political will to carry out some very tough reforms. How can we tell which countries are serious about these reforms? One way is to see which countries have put forth their wish list of support needs under the Category C provisions of the TFA. 14 WTO member countries have now added their wish list for reform assistance. At least between 8 or 11 of these have existing USAID missions and should be the focus of U.S. for support and implementation. In 2015, USAID, with the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, announced their primary role in the inception of the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation, a PPP that was created to support TFA implementation efforts in emerging countries. The alliance includes the World Economic Forum, the International Chamber of Commerce, and the Center for International Private Enterprise, as well as the governments of US, Canada, Germany, Australia, the UK, and various partner multinational companies. We have the great fortune to welcome to our panel today several of the Global Alliance members. So let's get started. I will start off with Sarah Thorne from Walmart. She's the Senior Director of International Trade and Supply Chains. Sarah, I'd like to ask you to start off, how does the private sector view the TFA and its objectives and goals? And how would you recommend the private sector engage in the TFA for its operationalization efforts?
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. And I've said this before in panels. I'll say it again. We think the Trade Facilitation Agreement is one of the most important agreements ever negotiated. So I'll say it again. That the WTO TFA is one of the most important trade agreements ever negotiated in the WTO. And it's not the sexiest agreement. It's kind of, pretty in the weeds, but it's about really the of trade. How do you operationalize trade? So how do you actually make it so that people can move product and move services and actually participate in trade? And what we have seen over time is a lot of the angst over trade is about the benefits of trade, who gets to be a beneficiary of trade. And if trade is only the exclusive right of the biggest companies that can work through a bad system, then it's not really working for everybody. So TFA is fundamental to development, and it's fundamental to spreading the benefits of trade more broadly to underserved populations, because it will democratize trade. If you have automated systems, if you have pre-clearance, then anybody can play. And it sounds so obvious, but it's sort of hard. If you publish the rules, what do I need to do to trade? What do I need to know to export? Then it's easier for everybody to take advantage. And I think it helps to break that sort of north-south divide that we've seen on trade, in that this is it's in every country's enlightened self-interest to adhere to the TFA, to implement the commitments, because what it means is my traders, my people, my businesses get to participate in the global economy. I think it's even more important with how trade flows are changing. So we're seeing a lot more trade now that is B2C. So the business in country X selling direct to consumer, leveraging the internet and internet platforms. But still, it doesn't matter. You could have the highest speed broadband, and if you can't get your product there, nobody can buy it. And if you can't have, payments that work globally, and you can't have, if your standards aren't matched, then it doesn't really matter. And so it all comes back to the ability to move things, and that's what essentially the TFA is. So it's in our interest as a big company, it's in developing countries' interests, it's in small business interests to actually do this and do it right. And it's just money in people's pockets, because right now the friction at the border and the time it takes to move product and the energy it takes to actually clear products, that's just waste. And for Walmart, we hate waste. We hate and we love efficiency. So this is like, I don't have to sell this hard internally to say, this is why I'm spending my time on this, because people are like, oh, I get that. I want my stuff. And I want to move faster. And I will tell you, at Walmart, we spent a lot of time about 10 years ago thinking about what are the systems and processes we need internally so that it's faster for us to trade. How do we have the right systems at Walmart so we can pre-clear goods, so that we have our manifest, so that before that boat arrives in a port, the product has already been cleared. And we invested a lot up front so we can save a lot of money over the long run, so that we don't have a particularly high open rate. And that helps our customers, and it helps everybody who's trying to save money so they can live better, because there's more money in their pockets because we can actually price effectively our goods. So that's why we love it. How can we participate, and how can the private sector participate? You know, one of the things we appreciate about the Global Alliance is we are a global company. We're in 28 markets around the world. We source from another, I don't know, every day it changes. But we source from nearly every market that we're allowed to in the world. And so we have kind of eyes and ears on the ground, and we know what's working and what's not working. And we're not the only ones. Many companies, local companies, international companies, can actually say, gee, it took me 2 weeks to get an aflatoxin certificate. That's not going to work for me for exporting cashews. So we have knowledge that is inherent to the operations of trade. We're not great, Walmart, at designing a perfect electronic custom system, but they are. Or they are. Or DHL was here. They are. They actually do that for a living. And so there's inherent knowledge in the business that is both part of our business but also can be translated. And I think because the TFA is very much about processes and about rules, it's not per se, it doesn't really fall so well into a traditional development project where you're, have a pot of money and an implementer who can just go and do it. You actually need to understand what the problem is, you need to have real co-collaboration to figure out how you address that problem, and you need buy-in from a lot of different people. So you can't really have, and this is a challenge when you're trying to actually do the implementation, it's not pretty, it's not discreet, it's not like, oh, I trained 1 million farmers and I'm done. It's really complicated, it's a long-term project, but that's why I think you need to do this in partnership with governments, with the private sector, with NGOs, with civil society, so that you get the best outcome for everybody. But we're incredibly enthusiastic. We also think the TFA going forward is the right kind of model for future trade agreements, where it's just not going to work anymore to say this is the commitment and you have 2 years to get there. We actually have the ability to help countries around the world with capacity to be able to compete. And so as we're going forward on e-commerce or any other new disciplines that we in the private sector think should be multilateralized, we should probably look at this as an example of how we get everybody on board and get better consensus, because it's pretty amazing that in this day and age, this agreement was actually agreed to. A multilateral agreement on a consensus basis in the WTO. It got done. So it means other things can get done that way, but we have to be thinking a little bit differently about how we negotiate trade agreements and then how we implement them.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate that. And I know that for those of you that don't know Sarah, she has been really out there all over the world working with customs administrations.
I thought you were going to stop really out there.
Out there, yeah. She's been really out there.
Really out there.
No, she's on the ground doing the work, so she really knows this. And in the second question, we'll get back to her too, is a little bit about smaller companies and how can they participate and get benefit out of this. I'd like to go next to Norm Shank. He is the chair of the ICC Commission on Customs and Trade Facilitation. He's also with UPS, has a long trajectory in this area as well. And I'd like to ask you, Norm, what is the ICC Commission on Customs and Trade Facilitation for the folks here that hear this for the first time? And how is the Commission's work on the TFA operationalizing, how come we can't say that word? Operationalizing, and how is that different from the work that you have been traditionally doing with the WCO? So how is the Commission's work the same, and together, how can you work together with the WCO? And I also like to tie in something, Sarah was talking about, how can we leverage, since there's all these different countries, now that we're trying to get them to harmonize, how can your two organizations work so that we don't have to, each country doesn't have to reinvent everything from the beginning, but can maybe take from some of the best practices?
Thanks, Anna. Good to be here. I'll just run through some quick talking points so we leave time for some interaction on that. But first, real quickly, on the International Chamber of Commerce, we have about 6.5 million members in over 100 countries around the world. But when you include in through the memberships in the countries, we probably we're the largest voice of international business, representing over 40 million companies around the world. So we have all dealing with international, so we have a keen interest in the TFA. Our primary goal is to really promote cross-border trade and investment on that. And the Commission on Customs and Trade Facilitation, our role is to provide advice to governments directly. We do a lot of work through the World Customs Organization and work with donor groups and others that have, shared interests to help improve border facilitation, because the reality is, flipping to UPS for a quick second, the biggest bottle in the international supply chain is at the borders. And you can pick almost any country, and I'd ask you to provide 3 where it's not, and I think you'd be pretty hard-pressed to find 3, but it's the biggest bottleneck in international supply chains, which also means it's the biggest barrier to international trade and investment, and companies are making decisions on the ability to get goods across the borders on that. So we do a lot of work advising. I'm going to kind of roll the questions together with that. So historically, let me first say why the World Customs Organization is important. And really, the best way I can explain it is the World Customs Organization is kind of like the United Nations when it comes to customs procedures. Put a lot of things together, but don't have the authority to mandate countries to do that. Excuse me. So it's important. Excuse me, I got dry all of a sudden. Must be the pressure of being up here with this esteemed group. On that. So the WCO has a lot of procedures, tools to help countries implement that. So up to this point, most of our work with the Commission has been working on policy documents, and we do everything from customs valuation to how to do transport smarter and greener. Over the last 3 years since I've been involved, we've had about 8 policy statements. So when it comes to the TFA, how do we kind of bring things together to accomplish common goals and incorporate into that? In terms of how it's going to change going forward, our role currently with the WCO, more on advising, is what we're looking to do is directly engage with countries. And since we have so many members around the world that know the business in their countries, we want to really basically shake them and say, you got to be directly involved working with the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation, World Bank, or whoever it is that has knocked down the key barrier of getting the trade agreement and getting a consensus to do it, but somebody that has the technical knowledge needs to support with that, and that's really where our role with the ICC is. And the other thing is, I think the business perspective certainly need to be really involved with not just the roll-up-your-sleeves work, but when it comes to influence, local political will, how do we sell the proposition, the value proposition to countries on, if you implement this, these are the benefits that you get from that. And I get a lot of informal questions from companies that'll just say, hey, we're looking to invest here. just give me your UPS experience from, I do a reasonable amount of travel of, how's this country to work with or not? It is an upfront decision maker. So these things with respect to the implementation will have a direct result on the dollars flowing into that country, and which is going to create jobs and hopefully prosperity. So I don't mean to sound philosophical, but it really is that important. It's about jobs, growth, and prosperity when it comes down to it. And then the other thing is, working with the groups, the WCO, is how do we help countries solve their problems, these customs administration? Illicit goods is a huge global problem, I would say, from an ICC and a UPS perspective. Illicit goods has to be in the top 2 things that I work on these days. Everybody sees in the news the opioid crisis, and some of the challenges of that, but it's not just that. Just real quickly, I testified, I think, 17 years ago on some of these issues, and back then we were talking about fake Rolex watches and I can't remember the name of the party drug, but there was a party drug at the time. Now we're talking about fake airbags going into brand new motor vehicles. We're talking about fake aircraft parts on the planes that we all fly on. We're talking about drugs where 98% of the pharmaceutical thing. So I think you get the point on this. So we can also, through part of implementing the TFA, help countries solve some of their problems.
Wow, that's an important issue that we don't always think about when we're talking about the TFA and some of the benefits. I know Norm doesn't look like it, but he's had over 40 years working on customs and trade policy. So he actually started before he was born. And thank you for that. And in that experience, he's been working directly with governments and customs administrations and helping to implement some of the best practices. So I think you are a great person to have chairing the ICC Commission right now. Thank you for that. What I'd like to do is come around with a second set of questions for each of the panelists, and then we're going to open it up to you. So start thinking.
You get her first.
We're going to go back to Virginia. I'm so sorry. I was thinking that went really fast. So actually, Virginia, since I'm going to take some time to really talk you up because she is a lawyer. She is the director of the Office of Trade and Regulatory Affairs at USAID, but she has also worked at USTR in the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee, in the CBP, Customs and Border Protection. So she's worked all aspects of this issue for many, many years. So thank you for being here. And for this first set of questions, Virginia, if you could talk a little bit about what is USAID's role in helping countries to ratify the TFA, and what are the next steps? Because you've played a role now in getting to where we are. And then what do you think is the most important long-term impacts of a successful TFA, particularly in prosperity and development, because it is our project?
Thanks, Anna. Sometimes when they go through my bio, it sounds like I couldn't keep a job, but that's really not true. So, and I tell people I'm at the best one yet, being at AID and helping to really work on the ground in developing countries to get to the next level and helping on the prosperity project. So AID has been involved with the TFA really from the beginning, because we were part of the negotiating team, because from the very beginning, given the modalities, for those of you who know that word in the WTO, the assistance angle we knew was going to be part of the agreement. So that's why we were involved from the negotiations from the beginning. On the assistance side, though, during those negotiations, we helped countries. We did 27 needs assessments, and that was to help countries start to get used to this idea of the categories A, B, and C that have been talked about. The category A is what the country will do on entry into force, which we're already there. B is the category that they will do later, and I'll get to that in a minute, but don't need assistance. And then C is the category, the provisions that they need assistance with. In the B and C situations, the countries can pick their time frames, and that's a really important piece of this, and I'll come back to the long-term effects, I think, of this agreement on that. But so we've worked with countries to get into those categories and then to start the conversation about time frames. I did want to mention one thing, though, in your note that you were talking about. It says that Category C is a fancy term for this wish list. And in many ways, it is a wish list in the sense of this is what they're asking donors for help on. But it is also important to remember, but anything in C is something that the country still has to implement. It's not just an aspirational part.
And the pony.
Yeah, and a pony, right, right. It's not just an aspirational thing to have a commitment in C. So I just wanted to make that clear when everyone goes to the internet. And as you can see, I highlighted and read the note. So where are we now? Now that we have entry into force, we've done those needs assessments, and we're ready to help countries actually implement, which is very exciting. We are really working in two lanes at AID. We're working in sort of the U.S. government implementation side, and I'll cover that a little bit, and then we're working on the actual providing assistance side. So let me quickly cover the U.S. side of implementation, because that will also give you a sense of what other countries are having to do sort of institutionally to get up and running on this, whether they be developing or developed. We are obligated as a donor country, as a developed country, and the text of the agreement says developed and countries in a position to do so who will provide assistance. So that's aimed at countries like China, Brazil, others South Africa, who could potentially be in a position to provide assistance. We all have to notify the assistance that we're giving. So that's been our first step. We got our OECD information together, and we sent our notification off to the WTO under Article 22 to say, yes, we have indeed been providing assistance. So it's important to note that that's going to be an annual commitment that the USG has. So that's something that AID right away has been working on. We worked with other donors to sort of come up with a format that will be helpful to our developing country, host country partners, but as well as at the WTO in terms of the legal side of notification. We're also part of the U.S. National Trade Facilitation Committee, which is a really important part of this agreement. All countries have to establish a National Trade Facilitation Committee. What's important there is they can't put that in category A, B, or C. That has to be something that's established right at entry into force. So we are working actually with countries to ensure that they have National Trade Facilitation Committees up and running, but we're also participating in ours. Ours is run by USTR through the TPSC process, the Trade Policy Staff Committee process. We're also working with USTR on the rules of procedure for the new Trade Facilitation Committee. I think we all need to remember that this is the very first agreement that the WTO has ever reached. So we do have precedents in the GATT for how committees function, but everyone's looking at this agreement to maybe set new rules of procedure, look at different ways to do things. So that's an ongoing discussion right now that we're having through USTR with the folks with the Secretariat in Geneva to understand how we can bring sort of the assistance reporting and conversations among donors into the committee setting. So I think that's really important. Let me turn then to the assistance. I mentioned the categories A, B, and C's. The developing countries should have already put in their B's and C's with notional timelines of when they will implement the provisions. And this is where this agreement can sound complicated if you sort of weren't involved from the beginning to end like some of us. Right now we're in a period where countries will be, that for the provisions that they haven't said they'll do right now, entry into force, they have to then go through provision by provision and say, we're going to implement this provision on whatever, October 1st of 2020. They need to go provision by provision for that. So we're working with countries on that. I should mention that least developed countries, LDCs, have an extra year to do that. So we work in a lot of LDCs, so we have some time. But this is a very important conversation in terms of, and I'm not going to be able to do it either, operationalizing. We had the TION, none of us can seem to get on there. Yeah. But in terms of operationalizing the agreement, this is key right now of where we're at in helping countries pick these timeframes. 20 countries have notified their Bs and Cs, and I'm happy to say 5 of those are LDCs. So they've come in early. So for us, that's really key because we can start focusing and saying they have the political will that was mentioned early. They have the political will to implement. These are the countries that we should be looking to help. So that's the dialogue we're having, urging our host countries, and we have over 70 out there, to start getting these notifications and to signal to donors that they're interested in getting assistance, because until those notifications come in, we really can't assess the political will. 54% of all countries haven't notified yet, so that's a bit of a problem, and that's where we're putting our focus. We're really supporting that on the ground through our missions and those kinds of conversations, working with state. And then on the assistance side, we're working on with the Global Alliance. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But you also asked me about the most important long-term impacts of the TFA, and I want to just quickly get to that. It is groundbreaking because it's the first agreement, but I was saying earlier in a conversation that the most important principle we have to remember about this agreement, no matter what you hear people say, is that all members have agreed to implement every single provision of that agreement. And Sarah alluded to the fact that this agreement's potentially being looked to as a model for other things now being discussed in Geneva. So I think that fundamental principle is really important. But that's why we have to make sure that all these different timeframes that have been set up for notification, all the requirements, and end up all working at the end of the day to get us to that end game where every single member of the WTO has fully implemented that agreement. And it's going to be far out because countries can pick those timeframes pretty far out. But that is the overarching, I think, important long-term impact that this agreement can have, is that this can be done. It can be done in a different way. It can be done in partnership with countries that provide assistance and countries that need assistance. And that's really what I would say is going to be the long-term impact of this agreement if it's fully successful. Well, when it's fully successful.
When. Thank you, Virginia. Thank you for that. So as I was starting to say, we're going to have one more round of questions, discussions amongst ourselves, and then I'm going to open it up for questions so you can start thinking of what you might like to ask this group. We will go back to Sarah first. And Sarah, for this second round, I'd like to ask a little bit more about how the TFA can help create more inclusive value chains, especially with key U.S. markets. And because in addition to just the moral value of including companies that have been historically excluded from global value chains, how does this provide opportunities for U.S. corporations like Walmart? So not only how does it help the small companies that have traditionally been excluded, but why is this good for a company like Walmart?
Sure. You know, as I travel around and meet small businesses, a lot of the first questions I get is, I want to sell to Walmart, how do I do it? And in particular, in emerging markets, there's a real thirst to be part of global value chains, whether you're providing a part to a bigger part that goes into a value chain, or you're a small seller who wants to sell directly to a bigger player. In the past, I've always said, gee, I'm so sorry, but that's the hardest. You just asked to do the hardest thing. You asked to do small business, sell to me in the United States. Really hard from so many reasons, both in terms of standards, audit protocols, but also because of just the logistics of getting your product at the right quality, in the right time frame, to a major multinational. I do think that TFA has an opportunity to break down some of that friction. A lot of the challenges have to do with just simple logistics, that it's hard for smaller sellers to even have enough product to get it into a container, to get it on a boat, to get it off a boat, to even understand how do I classify my product. In many emerging markets, if you can't import, you can't export. So for example, in a lot of countries, we would like to be doing more apparel production, but what's sort of the holy grail for apparel is vertical integration. So if you can't import snaps and zippers and fasteners and all of these things that you need to actually have full production lines, it's really hard to be an economic powerhouse. So this works both ways for smaller sellers, for emerging markets, to actually help them be part of a global value chain, because if you're clearing up sort of the friction at the border, then you can import, you can be part of global value chains, you can vertically integrate, and you can export. I mean, AGOA for me is interesting because those are the best rules for textile trade anywhere. And yet, as Walmart, we don't actually import all that much from Africa. We just really don't, because we just haven't seen, it's been just too hard and it takes too long, and sometimes the boats don't show up. So figuring this out, no, it's seriously, if you can't get your product to you, you do not want that product. I mean, reliability, it doesn't matter if it's past the season and it's like Merry Christmas, you know, and you get it on Easter, that doesn't work. So being a good, reliable supplier means importing and exporting and helping that. I think also, you know, for some of the smaller sellers, it's amazingly complex when you're doing everything by paper. You know, a lot of the development I've seen is because countries have been able to skip hop sort of the old way, right? So you don't need to have phones and landlines, because you can skip hop into tech and into cell phones, and then you can move that into electronic payments. But somehow we still think it's okay to do this and do you know, everything has to be done by paper. So I get this one customs agent who knows what my product is and knows knows how to classify it. And then a new guy comes the next day and a new guy the next day. It makes absolutely no sense. So automation will help those smaller sellers be able to actually do that sort of full service on moving your product and service. And then the last thing I'll say is information, because a lot of what prohibits those smaller businesses from being able to sell is they just don't know. What are your standards? What are the requirements? How do I export? What is a freight forward? What? So getting that information online and published is sort of a first step, making sure people understand how they can classify their products, making sure they understand who they can go to and how to get that product to a potential buyer internationally, I think is really important. And I do think with more and more package-based trade, more of these micro multinationals, there's a little bit more pressure now, consumer pressure and other pressure, because you can see, like, hey, where's my stuff? You know, and if it's sitting at the border for 2 weeks, that's going to put pressure on governments to actually get that process moving a little faster.
Great, thank you. So, I mean, it really is going to allow countries to become part of global value chains that possibly they wouldn't have thought of being capable of doing that in the past. Thank you. So, just to make sure I don't skip you, Virginia, we're going to go to you next. Norm, if you don't mind.
Please.
Okay, so Virginia, you gave us a great briefing just a little while ago about all the other things that the USAID has been doing, how you have interacted in the process, and how you are working with countries in this operationalization. So I'd like, if you could talk a little bit about how the USAID plans to engage with the private sector for optimal FTA implementation. I'm not going to say that other word anymore. And what are the benefits of U.S. leadership in TFA operationalization? Because, you know, some folks may be thinking, well, you know, this is something that's happening on the global level, the World Bank's involved, other people involved. Why does the U.S. need to really take a leadership role on this?
Thanks. Well, this is actually the more interesting part. I was reflecting, thinking all that A, B, and C and all that sort of thing sounded like very legalistic around the agreement. So it's really engaging with the private sector to get implementation going, which is the more exciting thing, and that's really what we're doing in country. I mean, we really consider the private sector to be just an indispensable partner in our effort moving forward in implementing the agreement. I mean, Sarah alluded to some of the things, and well, both Norm and Sarah, the problems that the businesses see day in and day out at the border. And it's really, really important to have a way to factor that into the designing of our projects in any given country. So you've heard us talk about the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation. Several of us have mentioned it. We formed it 18 months ago. And we decided this would be our showcase vehicle for implementation of the Trade Facilitation Agreement. We have over 24 companies, 2 of whom are sitting on each side of me. Maersk is involved as well, Fiat, Chrysler, and others. It's a multi-donor project as well with the UK, Australia, Canada, and Germany. So it's really a big effort and is really considered the first effort of this kind of a public-private partnership to support implementation of a trade agreement. The Secretariat's housed at the World Economic Forum. Many of you may know that they're very good at analytics. That was one reason we chose them as a partner. They have a lot of metrics and they get a lot of information from the private sector. So that was a very important piece in terms of choosing a secretariat that could bring that kind of information to the table. So why did we do this? We did it because we wanted to get the private sector input in every part of how we deliver assistance. And that goes to choosing the countries in which we're going to work. And some of that goes to what I talked about earlier, who's notifying, but then getting from, Norm mentioned it. He gets questions all the time, like, what's this country, do they seem to have the political will to change, right? And the private sector can give us a different side of that than we get, say, from the State Department or even from these notifications at the WTO. To then, how the process is working is our other 2 partners, CIPE, the Center for International Private Enterprise, which is the nonprofit arm of the U.S. Chamber, and then the International Chamber of Commerce that Norm talked about. They're the other 2 partners in this in terms of associations. They help bring together companies on the ground in the countries that are chosen to start the process of designing a project by a roundtable, and I think you may have even, both of you have probably, I think, engaged in some of those roundtables. And so the idea is to really co-create a project with the private sector. And sometimes that's easier to do than other times, because certainly what we've seen, and we laugh about it among ourselves, is the development folks have sort of one idea of a timeline of a project, and the private sector has a completely different idea of a timeline. And I can't tell you how many times they say to us, well, everything happens for us quarterly, right? And we're sort of thinking much longer term than that. So that part's, though, been very good. We're trying to take the best of both the private sector way of doing business and the development actor way of doing business and putting it together to co-create projects that can move quicker potentially than some of our traditional ways of delivering assistance. So we're also then going to build in a back end of evaluating that, and part of why we wanted the private sector engaged in that was to be able to use their real life experience in terms of time and cost to trade. And again, that's where WEF is coming in. WEF has some privacy information sharing agreements with some of our partners where they'll give WEF some data that is commercially sensitive, so we wouldn't get access to it, or a typical implementing partner for us wouldn't get access to it, but WEF can get access to it to help us build some better metrics to measure are our interventions really making a difference in reducing time and cost to trade. So that's really how we're engaging the private sector. The U.S. leadership part, I think part of it is just our ability to bring our private sector, right? I mean, that is huge. And we're showing that we can do that our private sector is receptive to helping and receptive to doing things in developing countries, countries which in some cases they don't even have business operations in, but they feel that they want to help on the development side, whether in some cases then to ultimately be able to bring SMEs into value chains and that sort of thing. So I think we're just showing leadership in that way, and I think that's very important. And I'll tell you, the other donor partners, they did wait for us to be the first mover. And then they came, I mean, we did a bit of a sales job, but they're like, tell us more, tell us more, tell us more. But we were the first ones to step up and say, let's do this assistance differently. And I think we're all very proud of that, and I think it shows that the U.S. can be a leader in that. I think what's most important, you covered it on a bit. I mean, the economic growth statistics around this agreement sort of speak for themselves. I mean, we know that trade lifts people out of poverty. That's key, has been key to the economic growth theories in development for a long time. But it's mutually beneficial. It's also a market access issue for our companies. Our companies and who are looking to export from the United States, running candidly to some of the same problems you were talking about certainly about the SMEs and trying to get things out of their country. Our companies run into the same thing going into our host countries. So it's really a win for all of us. These are universal principles that we need to streamline border operations. And people now start talking more and more about e-commerce and goods moving through the e-commerce channel. I just have to say, if we don't get these fundamental trade facilitation pieces finished quickly, a lot of these countries aren't going to be able to engage in e-commerce, just like they couldn't engage in traditional value chains. They're going to completely, and unfortunately it's going to be really the entrepreneurs in our host countries and the SMEs that aren't going to be able to really get on this wave of e-commerce, which is moving quickly. They have to be able to move the stuff. So that's what this is about, and I really think the leadership that we can show from best practices as well as our private sector coming and sharing some of their metrics and things like that can show that why U.S. leadership is important.
Great, thank you, Virginia. I think to your point of that, with the U.S. leadership, we're able to bring in the U.S. private sector. And I think that's really key because it's always much easier from the beginning to help shape the way something's going to turn out than to come in later and say, oh, that's bad, you didn't do that right, and then try to change it when you weren't even a player in the beginning. So I think that is also a very key for why we should have U.S. leadership. And there is really no question, no doubt that if with these countries, if we can get them more involved in the global market and global value chains, and it can help their local economic development, that it's going to create new markets for U.S. companies, and it's also going to create a broader consumer base overseas for people to buy our products there. So I want to thank everybody, and before I open it up for questions, does anybody on the panel have an additional comment or want to comment on something that our colleagues have said?
Just on the Global Alliance, it's we've been working on this for about 18 months, and it seems like that's a long time to put something in place. But I think part of why, it just took a while to speak the same language, not just between the private sector and the development assistance community, but among the development assistance community, and also to really think through in a very, I appreciated USAID and Virginia and Elizabeth's insistence that we do everything the right way, that we get it all written down right, that we think about what are the projects, what are the scope, who's in what role, how do we have metrics and evaluation, because I hope that the Global Alliance can be a model going forward for public-private partnership and development assistance, because we've been in the public-private partnership game for a while, and I think it's evolving, but this is really interesting on the co-creation side. Usually you have an idea, or one party has an idea and you bring it to another party. Very different to co-create, and I'm hoping that we'll be a victim of our own success. Then when we see projects actually delivering results, there'll be that sort of jet stream of other countries saying, me, I want to too, because this really is straight up in countries' self-interest to do. It's a pain. It's hard to align all of the different border agencies to coordinate and to have sort of better, faster, more efficient systems. And they're vested in political interests sometimes to keeping your own little fiefdoms. But it's so in the interest of developing and developed countries to do this. So I actually applaud the patience of our development assistance partners in actually just being very positive and pushing through and getting us to a point where I feel like we're really starting to move in an effective and efficient way. And I encourage the other companies in the room to talk to us about how you can participate, because one of the best, easiest ways is to participate in country in that assessment part of it, you know, doing the roundtables, getting your companies engaged. If you have a particular problem in a country and you want it solved, this is a really fast and good way to do it. And we're looking for some of that low-hanging fruit for proof of concept up front.
Awesome, thank you. And so before we turn to the questions, I want to ask Norm the final question. And Norm, if you can take off your hat of chair of ICC for a moment and put on your UPS hat as VP of Global Customs Policy and Public Affairs, I'd like to ask you, and follow up to some of the comments, what would full implementation of the TFA mean for UPS? And also more importantly, or as importantly, what would it mean to UPS's customers?
Thanks again, Anna. I'll go through real quick several on each front. Certainly full implementation would have a huge impact on cost and service. As I mentioned, border holds are one of our biggest cost drivers, and ultimately it has to be, unfortunately, passed on through rates to our customers on that. So we reduce our cost on that, and then it gives not just better cost, less cost for our customers, but ultimately we're going to improve service and reliability on that one. Another thing from a UPS perspective is we serve over 200 countries around the world, and the reality is for us to be efficient and effective, we can't have 200 different procedures in these countries, which then means we have to develop 200 different system solutions, which are costly on that. So as the TFA gets fully implemented, that'll narrow the gap between countries' border processes on that one. The other thing that's going to help with, most of the discussion on in and out, but many of these regions around the world, it's not like driving across state lines with your products. Particularly Africa is a huge problem, part of Asia, where for moving our goods through borders to get to other countries has huge barriers on its own, which I won't elaborate on, but the ability to move through countries as well as in and out of countries on that one. You know, again, I mentioned earlier today that from a UPS perspective, we're a service company. The only thing we have to offer is service to our customers. So really what's important to us is really driven by what's important to our customers. So that's why I always try and, that's why the ICC is so valuable, because I get more than an earful from many companies about what they want to hear on that one. The fourth thing is, certainly is, the TFA agreement is their foundational border clearance principles, and I used the phrase earlier, it's not rocket science, and then I was actually enlightened on, because I deal on it all the time, that I need to take a broader view, which is really true. I need to take a broader view on it. But really, all the TFA provisions are best practices somewhere in the world, so it's a matter of how can we show how good it is and then move on with that one. And then the last one, I think, is accountability. I was over at the World Customs Organization last week, and I had two Director Generals of Customs came up to me and said, hey, Norm, we submitted our A commitments for the TFA, and we did some checking, and we really don't meet those commitments. So some countries are like freaking out over not just the B and C that they've made commitments they haven't. So accountability is really important for everybody. And the last thing I would say is one of the things we're just got approval through the ICC leadership is we're going to start developing a global report card on technical brokerage clearance. There's some great indexes out there. You know, WEF has a good index, World Bank has a good index, OECD has some, but really and it's based on the earfuls I get from companies. It's like, why don't you do that? So if anybody has interest in that, it's a pretty good sized project, but if you have an interest, if you can give me your card on the way out, we'd love to get some feedback. And then the last thing I would say is, all the great work that's been done by those up here, and that is, this isn't going to get done by itself. We really need, I know Sarah travels a ton, Virginia travels a ton, Raul left on that. We can only be on so many airplanes. I only get home about 6 days a month as it is, and other than my wife being happy, it's kind of challenging on that. But we need everybody that's engaged in international in every perspective to just find a way to get involved, because you can make a difference, whether it's through the Alliance, supporting on the technical side or whatever, so we need everybody's help. Thank you.
Wow, great. Thank you, Norm. And I think, your point on the accountability is really important. And it may not even be, as the customs directors that talked to you said, it may not even be that people are trying to defraud the system. It may be that they have a certain idea in their mind of what fulfilling a certain provision is. But in reality, it really doesn't meet what the standards are. So I think that is very important going forward. So I would like to now turn it over to the audience. We have about 15 minutes. And what I'd like you to do is, yes, if I'll call on you, we have a microphone in the back. So if you can wait till the microphone gets to you so that it can be, this is everything being recorded and everyone can hear you. And then we'll go ahead and answer the question. So I think we have the gentleman in the back who wanted, like Norm's new program.
My name
if
My
you
name
could
is
stand
Dan.
up, please.
I have a computer on my lap. Excuse me for a second.
If you could tell us your name and
Dan
your
Silverstein.
organization.
I'm a private sector advisor, and I have my own advisory firm. Thanks. This was as good as any session that I've heard. Anna, I thought your summary at the beginning was extremely helpful. With those compliments, I'd like to ask a tough question. It seems to me that trade is always a function of chokeholds in specific places where seemingly insignificant people become extraordinarily significant. Not insignificant, but bureaucrats become extraordinarily significant. My interest is in agriculture. So everything that you just talked about is exacerbated by the perishability of the products. And Norm, you just made this passing reference to sub-Saharan Africa and going across countries and stuff. It all comes down to some person who is going to hold up the order at the border in return for some kind of consideration. And so I'm not sure what I'm asking you, other than how about enforcement? You've talked very aspirationally about the country signing on and wanting to be sure that they qualify, but that's at the ministerial level. How do you make it work at the border?
Good question. Norm, you want to tackle that?
I'll take a stab at it. One perspective, a couple perspectives of it anyhow. I think certainly it starts with awareness and education. I see Megan back there from USCIV, one of our valued national members to the ICC. It really starts with education and awareness. And I'll just give you an example. I get sound bites all the time from members and emails and all these pings. But the cross-border issue in southern part of the hemisphere of Africa, we had several members who would just ping me constantly on, we got a problem, we got a problem, we got a problem. Okay, and finally it was like, all right, you need to sit down, take the time, draft a small 1 or 2 pager on it is, one of the things that we can start bringing awareness to it. And that member did that, went through on that. And now we finally got some momentum on the impact this is having on that. So certainly it starts with awareness on that. And then I get around pretty good around the world. A lot of times it comes down to building relationships and getting to the right people of getting something done. One of the downsides of what I do at UPS is we do a lot of one-off deals. And the TFA is really going to help deal with that. Remember, I mentioned the 200 countries on that. One-off deals are great, but you have a commissioner of customs changes, all of a sudden your one-off deal may be done. And I'm not talking about illegal stuff, it's all above board, but that type of thing. So it's, again, education awareness, finding people that have some contacts, then getting through the right people, and then leveraging groups like USAID that may have a strong foothold or relationship with the country and try and move it forward. Agriculture is really complicated. I know enough to maybe speak a little dangerously on it. It's really complicated.
I mean, so it's not a panacea, but automation helps, because automation takes out that human factor that can complicate these issues. It is widely known that many of these government officials are not paid sufficiently, and it's sort of inculcated that there is a payment or a facilitating payment to get your permit or get you this or get you that. And that's not legal. It's not legal anymore under the UK or bribery and corruption, and that's sort of the standard that most multinationals have taken. And so we have to think of different ways to make sure that if we automate, then that's a process that doesn't have a human factor in it. That's not going to happen overnight. It's certainly not going to happen in sub-Saharan Africa overnight, but a progress towards automation does help reduce that human factor. There are countries in Africa where we go around them. Like, we can't go through. It just takes too long and it costs too much. You drive the truck all the way around. And that's not good for that country. In the end, it's not good for their participation in the global trading system. So I think part of the other answer is when you show models that are working, when your neighbors are doing better than you because they've done the right things, because they respect rule of law, because they have efficient ports and customs, then you get emulation. And that's what we're trying to do, is create the right systems and processes that you want to have a race to the top and not the bottom.
Which, if I may, which is one of the reasons why I impulsively applauded when you talked about creating a system of measurement. The Doing Business Index, et cetera, started with the World Bank with countries being very resentful about being scored if they were scored near the bottom, until the World Bank Group took them under their wing and said, look, we'll let us have you talk to some of the countries that are doing it well and emulate what they're doing. And then they loved it, because then they began to show that they were going up the scale. And so I think that this is a great way to get all of these countries to comply. Peer pressure.
Comment on the ag side, because I think this is really important. A lot of times when I talk about this agreement, I very clearly say this isn't just an agreement about customs. Because even in the U.S., we tend to fall into that sort of idea that this is all about and the ag piece is really important to acknowledge that it's not. I mean, I remember standing in sub-Saharan Africa on the border between Kenya and Uganda, I guess it was, and we were talking with customs, and we were talking about agricultural products moving, and all the complaints that we had heard. And the customs port director told me, well, it's not our problem. We don't care. That stuff's moving duty-free. It's moving within the EAC at a zero rate of duty. We don't care as customs, right? And the point is, this agreement goes to that, right? It goes to the coordination of all the border agencies. And I mean, there are articles related to alerts for holds on SPS and that sort of thing. But I think it is really important to remember this is about all the border agencies, not just customs, and the ag piece really comes in there. Because, and candidly, I was one of the negotiators. That was the toughest part of this negotiation, was that countries didn't want to let go on SPS and their ability on the ag side at borders, right? But we got the agreement anyway, and I think we should really focus more and more on that. And even with us, we're working with our Bureau of Food Security with the new generation of Feed the Future now to ensure that we get some of this in there on that side, that agricultural products need to be able to flow for lots of reasons, but food security is one of them. So I just want to make that point on the ag side.
Yeah, and I think that is a good point, because it's it's not only about one agency, and sometimes we talk a lot about putting this on customs, but they don't have authority over the other agencies, and that's why, you know, we've had some discussion in some of our meetings here is we've moved from the diplomacy part in Geneva, and now we're at the part where we have to implement, and it's really local politics. And it's local politics even within ministries and bureaucracies. So part of the challenge is identifying a warrior or a person in each of the countries that has the authority and the respect of various agencies to take this project on and move it forward. We have time for maybe one other question. So we have 2 hands. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow them both, if you can make them quick. We'll start with you.
And I've been doing a lot of work lately on the STOP Act, and so I'm wondering, you know, there are all of these best practices that are happening with the customs people, and I know Postal Service is a totally different animal, but I'm wondering if there could be spillover effects.
I'm going to let Norm answer that one. Okay, let's take the other question too.
All right.
Now.
My name is Dalton Booker. I'm a program associate at the Osgood Center for International Studies, and I was wondering if the TFA, how that would ensure that trade is fair as well as free, so that consumers in the U.S. aren't, or at least aren't unaware, supporting sweatshops in Cambodia or the destruction of the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, or buying, you know, conflict diamonds from somewhere in Africa that supports the warlord over there, that kind of thing.
That's a great question. So, Norm, if you mind tackling the first one on the post office, which I know is one of your favorite subjects, and maybe Virginia and Sarah the second question, and then you can all chime in.
Thanks for your question about the STOP Act in postal. So for those of you that aren't familiar, the purpose of the STOP Act is to bring everybody into the same requirements and have the post office do the same thing that the private sector has to do. So just in very high level view on that is express carriers, whether it's UPS, FedEx, or DHL, for example, we transmit advanced electronic data of the key data elements on 100% of all the shipments coming into the country so that Customs and Border Protection and other agencies can do risk assessment and determine whether they need to look at that as a high risk. The second thing is each of those packages also has a tracking label associated to it so that if CBP identified it, that's part of it, but if you can't give them the package to pick it off, and on that, so it's a very important piece, and you can look at the different reports out there, but I think it's pretty well accepted that the majority of the fentanyl and illicit drugs are coming in through the post on that. So it's a huge gap. Private sector, again, UPS, FedEx, and DHL were dwarfed by the Postal Service. In a nutshell, can I give a quick analogy of this one? This issue is very personal for me on this, and I've been working on it for a long time. I do a lot of international travel, and when I get on an airplane to come back to the U.S., and sometimes recently from the Middle East, when I get on that airplane, I don't look around the airplane thinking to myself, gee, did any of these people look suspicious that might be a terrorist I should keep an eye on? What I think about is the bags and bags of mail in the belly of the aircraft that are coming to the U.S., over 1 million packages a day that have absolutely no oversight whatsoever, and what could be in there. That's what scares the hell out of me, to be honest with you. And I say that more for my 4 grandchildren than I do for myself, because you can see I'm winding down on that, so I'm not afraid of that. But just the thought of what can be in those, and it's not just the fentanyl, all the things I described earlier on the illicit goods, really, it's an important way to, again, I know I work for UPS, but this one is so personal for me. If I didn't work for UPS, I'd probably be more vocal about it. On that is, we need to stop the flow of illicit goods into this country, and it's the biggest gap that there is right now. Thank you for raising the question.
Now you know I immediately thought Norm should take that question.
I don't have any strong feelings on it, though.
None at all. You put the fear in all of it. No, but very, very, very good point. Thank you for asking that question. So as far as the second question, Virginia or Sarah, you probably have a little bit different aspects of how to answer it. You can take a,
I'll start. I mean, a couple things. I first just wanted to point out on the Kimberly process, because I thought that was on conflict diamonds. I thought that was actually something I'd really want to pick up on. That was started by the private sector. And so it makes my case about how working with the private sector, in that case, the private sector really came up with a process that would allow diamonds to be traced through the process. I will mention that a lot of diamonds move by express carrier, but anyway. But so I think just from our side on the implementation side, you know, that shows you how bringing in the private sector could help us get kind of unique solutions to help with some of these problems. I would just say that on the TFA itself isn't going to solve a lot of the all the problems that you were talking about. I mean, at AID we have lots of different programs. We have programs in Bangladesh. I think you guys are part of them on the labor side. We have lots of different bureaus that are working on a lot of those issues. But I think fundamentally, because this is a WTO commitment, it says that everyone's going to play by the same rules. And so it gives everyone, whether you're a SME in the United States or an SME in Kenya or Botswana, hopefully the same chance to compete on a level playing field so that you can get your goods in and out, know which rules you have to abide by, and not have to rely on one-off deals or, you know, no offense to UPS. I know why they do it, and I know it's above board, but it's time for that to end, because really it is only big companies that can do that. So, I mean, we see this really more from that perspective, is that it does allow folks that haven't historically been able to plug in to the supply chain to do that. And again, we have tons of, or many programs related to the fair trade things and things like that. I can talk to you about that later, but I did want to pick up on that Kimberly process, because I worked on that at Customs. So, but the fact that was private sector driven, I think, is very important to remember.
I also think a lot of the issues you're talking about go back to transparency in supply chains and understanding where products are made and under what conditions, so consumers can make choices. And so this process, in theory, is going to be about making the whole trade function behind trade, how do we move goods, a bit more automated, a bit more regularized, and should help in that traceability and transparency. New technologies like blockchain, we're incredibly excited about, because a lot of what happens to multinationals is you can't see some of that because it's in subcontracted factories, or it's deep into the supply. I can't go into the mines in the Congo. So there are complexities in supply chains that hopefully we can disaggregate and have more visibility, so that the companies that are doing the right thing have better surveillance and oversight of those. Because generally in the end, those are conditions of poverty that create, and conditions of laws that aren't being enforced correctly. And so if you don't know about it, it's hard to enforce it. If you can't see it, it's hard to fix it. And so that's what we're all sort of collectively working on. And then with the capacity building you know, collaborative action, I would say, with NGOs, with multinational, with governments and civil society, that's how we kind of really try to tackle those big issues.
great, thank you. So, Sarah, 30-second closing words of wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to keep working on this until it's done. We don't see this as this is not going to be done next year. We see this as sort of a decade-long process. But if we can get this done right, I fundamentally believe it'll be good for consumers and really good for development. Because what you want to create in development is economic opportunity. And the best way to create economic opportunity is allow people to participate in the formal economy. And this is a way to regularize that.
Great, thank you. Virginia, 30-second closing comments?
Well, I would just really second everything that Sarah said. I mean, from our perspective, this is about economic growth in the countries in which we work. And this is something that has has held back economic growth to a certain extent in a lot of these countries. So it is going to be a long-term effort. We need people to stick with us. I think it's really important on the operationalizing side that just because we got an agreement signed, sealed, and delivered in Bali and now entry into force, that's just the beginning. So it is going to be a long process, but I think it's going to be a process at the end that's going to yield real results, both for U.S. Exporters and both exporters and importers in our host countries and developing countries. Thanks.
Thank you. Norm, 30-second closing comments?
I'll do it in 10. If you have any interest at all, whether it's your company or otherwise, in growing international trade, you need to get involved. There's plenty of opportunities.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for your interest. Since you're here, it shows that you have interest. So thank you for coming, and we hope to see you at the next one.